well, I'm welcoming lots of people who are interested in science and have sat through some highly interesting science papers, and I will try to make a few connections because I'm from arts. I do have one slide that has a bar graph on it, so that's one concession. And as you can see, as an arts person, I'm completely techno-inept.
Try that one.
Just try that one. Okay, so going back to our very first speaker and the idea of whether you map a career or not, I think that my career has been triggered and greatly enhanced by one question that was asked to me in the heat of the moment at my admission to candidacy exam at Cornell. There's another link to another science paper. And I was asked, who was listening in Vienna around 1800 and why should we care? Now you have to know that I came to Cornell to study Mozart and a canonic genre, the string quartet. And I knew at this awful moment that the answer was not Mozart string quartets, or in fact, any of the canonic composers that I was interested in studying and that were the main sort of things that I was studying for my admission to candidacy exam, and that this was a real sort of provocative question. The whole climate at Cornell in those days, which was the late 90s and early 2000s, was one of critique. We had Jonathan Culler doing comparative literature, and we were all busy deconstructing things and reading Theodore Adorno and trying to see how it would apply to our area. So this was very much a question that was provocative and designed to say, you know, why should we bother with what you're researching? So I went on to write a book that apparently doesn't do what it should have done, which was canonic critique. But in fact, what I was trying to do here with focusing on Beethoven, the most canonic composer in Western music history, arguably, and the string quartet, again, a very celebrated genre, was actually from the inside to offer some critique of this, what has become, and still is today, arguably, a very elitist and insular kind of subject. And so in this first book, I made a small gesture towards what hopefully has become a much bigger critique of Western classical music history and its culture. But it was really in the first chapter where I looked at other composers in Beethoven's Vienna, and in particular, more of a social view of that era and what other people were performing and playing. And I started to pick away at this question that I really made some inroads. So then we get to my next book, which is on cultivating string quartets. This is a little bit of a trot through book, sorry about that, but I've given you something interesting to look at here, which is that I got a 5-star rating on Amazon. But what I'm trying to say there is, hooray, only one of them, of course. This research was starting to get more relevant. This book was better liked than was the theatrical quartets book. And it was just an explosion of the first chapter where I started to look at actually the people and the agencies behind classical music and the performers. And suddenly people were interested in reading my work. And also to think about what music they were playing, which was not usually Beethoven or any of these other canonic composers. And one important discovery I made in writing this book was that actually a lot of the music that people were playing back then comprised arrangements. In other words, the spin-offs of larger scale performances like operas and symphony concerts that they could take home and play in their home on the piano with indeed a string quartet, or have a piano vocal arrangement, or play on all wind instruments. And so these arrangements, which are a little bit like today's sheet music from a Broadway musical or something like that, that was the popular music of the day and what a lot of people were playing and listening to. So this was part of the key to the answer to the question. Another Amazon website, I'm trying to gesture here towards the larger resonances of my research. So I've got Japanese Amazon here, and this is the sort of latest book that I've written in 2021, and that's where I did an alternative history of Beethoven's symphonies. And again, it's getting more and more critical, this research, more and more sort of an alternative view, so much so that when I gave this to a colleague and said, you know, here's my manuscript, could you please offer some comments? No, I don't read about that sort of thing. So this idea of looking at what everybody was doing and playing in the home is still a bit of a tension between this high art view of Western classical music, where we study composers and their works, capital W, and this view where we look at, well, what's everybody actually playing and listening to. And so this book talks about piano arrangements, it talks about domestic sphere, and not a lot about symphonies being held in concert halls and that kind of thing. So in the process of writing about this book, this led me to really close now to the answer to that original question. And just to remind you, because it was a few slides ago, that was the question of what were people listening to in Vienna? End of show. That was really quick, wasn't it? Shakan, part of the answer. Let's go back. Good. So, Selmira has played at the Italian Theatre 6 times, and each time to an overflowing auditorium. The worth of this work is proved by the applause of the Viennese public, who are very educated. But a big part of the answer to the question I started to discover when looking at sort of alternative lines of evidence, such as people's memoirs, such as letters, diaries, and these things that allow you to access the private sphere of musical life, which is very seldom written about in histories. In music, we still have a great events and heroes view, and also crises view of history. And so if we delve into this kind of literature and sort of ephemera, then we uncover a completely different view. Obviously, this is from a newspaper, but it's a newspaper of literature and art, and so not necessarily a mainstream newsfeed. And then we discover that Italian opera, in fact, in particular, the work of Rossini, was super important in the time of Beethoven. And his works and his persona are often held up as completely opposed and at the opposite side of a binarism to those of Beethoven. And so here's my one gesture to a bar graph, and don't look at it too closely, otherwise I might get some very curly questions about how to interpret this. But one thing is that you can see that opera of all kinds is reaching very high numbers of performances in this one central. There were 4 theatres in Vienna at this time. And we've got various kinds of opera and also other kinds of entertainments, ballets, divertissement, vaudeville, and that kind of thing. And within the Italian opera category, Rossini's music was extremely popular. And so these are the sort of some statistics or numbers anyway about works and their popularity. And you can see that Mozart, to whom I devoted myself in my dissertation, is quite a lot lower than somebody like Rossini. And then all sorts of people whose works and names we've never heard of today. And so delving into the world of the home and the domestic sphere, and then women's music making, which, of course, if we're talking about public sphere in those days, we're not largely talking about female performance except for a handful of opera singers. We find that they have a large role in the home, including in playing orchestral music and stage music. And so this is just one example from the Barber of Seville of Rossini, a beautiful title page with an enticing cover. And then, so what were men doing? Well, women were often playing piano and singing, although in this below slide we have Schubert at the piano, but these women were also artists themselves. And men were often playing these charkan instruments, which also double as a walking stick. So all sorts of interesting things you discover about the private sphere once you start to delve into it. As to reasons why they would be listening to so much, why theatricality and theatre music and theatrical entertainments in the home were so popular, well, we'd need another at least hour to go into that. But one of the reasons that I'm starting to develop is that they themselves, the Viennese, were being observed from all angles and listened to. So this was the time of the Metternich system. Early 19th century Vienna was a very strong police surveillance system going to make sure that the French Revolution didn't reoccur again in a different guise. And so actually large-scale public performances where lots of men got together and were increasingly suspect and not largely allowed to take place. And so a lot of domestic music making was taking place. And this era of spectatorship gave rise to a sense in which the Viennese themselves would want to start to enact and perform theatre and represent themselves and understand their situation through performance. Okay, so going very quickly to a completely different, apparently, strand in my research. Recently, I've been looking at Māori and Pacifica students in history courses. But this is actually, from my end, an attempt to connect these two strands and to see, because I'm very interested in pedagogy as well, and to see how it is today that we can understand the relevance of history and to uncover a number of the critical skills that are really useful when you start to talk about history. One of those being, of course, the ability to synthesize diverse sources of information with conflicting stories, and also think laterally about what our lines of evidence would be. So all sorts of useful critical skills for graduates today. But across the board in history, we're finding that we're getting increasingly less diverse students, or not able to attract and retain students, and in particular Māori and Pacifica. So I went around, talked to my colleagues about what it is, and did talanoa conversations with students with a team. This time I get to do teamwork as well in music. And as you can see, a range of reasons came up as to why history learning will be difficult, in particular the reading and writing emphasis. And so what we've uncovered in this teamwork is performance as being a quite central way that this particular cohort of students, and in fact, if I'm honest, a lot of students altogether enjoy learning through enactment and theatre and delivery, and that's part of what helps them to learn history and helps them to learn these critical skills. So thank you for your attention and listening.
Thanks once again for that. It was an amazing span of a remarkable career. We do have time, we've got coffee coming up soon, but we do have time for some quick questions.
Yes.
With COVID and students learning in different ways, your last comment, how do you see that impacting going forward?
I think we've learned a lot about how to use online technologies to good effect with performance students and with students that enjoy interaction. And so at the beginning of COVID, it was like, how on earth are we going to do this with this group? But in fact, some of the functionality that people have developed, including the ability to stream performance with effective sound and so on, breakout groups, and just putting people on the spot instead of pretending that you're in a lecture theatre and using that capability in a way that makes it really boring, frankly. That was a thing of that immediate reaction, but throughout COVID, I think we gradually developed so that students started to really enjoy what we were doing. And actually some of the voice teachers at the University of Auckland were very instrumental in developing really good camaraderie and group rapport through Zoom, amazingly enough.
I asked Owen what his favourite product was, and he told me his least favourites.
Okay. So I'm not going to get this thing composer.
Yeah, well, it strikes me as there is some similarity there that you're deconstructing.
I don't get to taste it.
No, right, but does it? Yeah, does your work and your research change your appreciation of music? Does it change what you like in your own taste?
Yeah, I mean, I still like Beethoven, and I still find it very difficult. I used to be a violinist, so it's still very difficult. I think that some of the composers that are listed there, they wrote some terrifically fun music that people just enjoyed. I mean, that was primarily, the reason that they were playing this music in the home. And when it's arranged for, one piano, 4 hands, that's just super fun. So I think one of to answer your question properly, one of the really interesting things is the way large-scale works get miniaturized and how much fun that is. Sheer fun. Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata for a string quintet, that's super, super fun. And that's actually a work that's been expanded, but it's ostensibly a very difficult, violin sonata. for piano and violin, and then when it gets distributed around 5 string instruments, and they would originally have all been men sitting around kind of after work, perhaps bankers, businessmen. They were amateur violinists and often very good, as you read on one of these slides. They're very talented in early 19th century Vienna, and they would have socialised and built up their network through this kind of musical discourse and interaction. So that's really interesting to find out.
One last question.
Yes.
So it might be a curly question, but it's
Yes.
something to do with your bar graph. So it sounds like a lot of music, and certainly maybe maybe I don't have enough information, but there's a lot of social aspect to music forever until
Absolutely.
actually fairly recently, where you begin to see, I think first people started accessing music that wasn't coming through popular sources. And now you see people walking around with headphones all the time. Was there the equivalent of headphones with music before, or is this really a change in the way we're experiencing and sharing music and using it as a kind of social connector?
Yes, the equivalent, the late 18th, early 19th century equivalent of headphones was the clavichord. Clavichord is this tiny little keyboard instrument that doesn't have very effective resonator, and it's actually so delicate that you can do bebung, which is a kind of vibrato where your finger comes in touch with the string and you can jiggle it around and make a kind of vibrato. But it's the office instrument. I have a clavichord in my office because nobody else can hear it, and even the performer has some difficulty hearing the clavichord. So that's the only equivalent to the headphones I can think of. But yeah, I think somewhere in Immanuel Kant's treatise he complains about the neighbourhood singing that he can hear in his apartment in wherever it was, Weimar, or wherever he lives. So I think music was through and through social until the advent of the
Okay, well, I think we better cut questions short there. I do want to just thank all our speakers this afternoon. You've all had amazing careers. You've all got many years ahead of you yet. And well done on condensing that all into 10 minutes and making it accessible for everyone. So thank you all, and thank you, Professor.